this great, amazing patriarchal figure dies, and he dies in Egypt with this commandment, don't leave me here, this isn't home. It's very much Adam knocking on the doors of paradise. This isn't home, I belong over there. And especially if you think about in the preparation for Pascha, at the end of, you're reading this at the end of Great Lent, like this realization, this is not where we belong. We're looking to the resurrection. We're awaiting the coming of the resurrection and the consummation that the resurrection brings. That's a good way to end a book. And it sets you up for the next things that are going to happen in the story of Exodus. But Joseph proclaims the resurrection from the dead. He proclaims the life of the world to come. Like, we're going to be brought from Egypt to the promised land. We're going to receive this full presence and resurrection here in the land that God has promised us. And so the book of Genesis prepares us for that. This is the way life is. This is the way it was created. This is the way we were created. This is what happened. These are the things, these are the results of the fall. And now we have to we're constantly in Exodus, in movement towards the promised land. And that's really I think the intent of Moses in Genesis. Not just to talk about where we come from, but from whom we come. God creates in this overabundance of love. He creates the world and he creates humanity to be in a relationship with him. And when they fall, when they are cast out of paradise, he doesn't then abandon them. He doesn't become indifferent to their plight or to the plight of the creation. He's constantly then at work to bring them back. But it's not just all right, Abraham, you all can come back to the Garden of Eden now. Like, there's now, humanity is tainted with with death. Humanity is tainted with this predilection to sin. And so the book of Genesis opens up that door for us, and we see the foundations for all the things that happen. We understand the reason for our sojourn here. And then from here on, the book of Exodus really opens up a lot of Old and New Testament theology for us. It's constantly the Exodus is constantly referenced by Christ. It's referenced by St. Paul. It's referenced throughout the rest of the Old Testament. This understanding that we are still in Exodus, and that there will be exoduses. You get that a lot in the major prophets. The second Exodus. You are going into exile. God is going to send you away, but God will bring you back and make you a new people. And you think about just several thousand people go to Egypt at first, but hundreds of thousands leave Egypt. They've come from a family to a full people. And they even bring strangers with them. We'll see that at the end, when the Exodus actually happens, they bring people who are not of the family of Israel, not Hebrews, but who have united themselves to the plight of the Hebrews. They will follow their God because they saw the miracles. We often call them plagues, but it's only a plague if you're an Egyptian. If you're a Hebrew, then it's a miracle of God. God is once again, just like in the book of Genesis, he's overthrowing the gods of nature, one by one establishing himself as the supreme power. And that's really the opening book of Genesis. God says the earth is formless and void. It's chaotic. It's covered in water. There's no shape. There's no reason behind it. It's dark. Whatever full, pure darkness means. And then God says, let there be light. So the first thing God has power over is the darkness. And then over the waters, and over the land, and over the animals, and over the plants, and then over humanity. So you see this again when we get to the miracles that God performs in Egypt. He takes each of their gods and disassembles it. We have a God of the river. Well, the God of your river is bleeding. We have a God of all this life, but this God is above those gods. And we see that in I don't know what the psalm is, but it's the Lord sits enthroned in the midst of the gods. All the spirits, if you will, and this is very kind of ancient cosmology, but there is one God who is enthroned above all the gods of all the earth. They all pay homage to him and are in submission to him. And so, even though these are books of historical record, they're not just historical record. And in fact, Origen, who is really the source of a lot of later theology of the Old Testament, says, like, we're supposed to see ourselves in the story. We're supposed to see it's not a history of the kings of Egypt, it's a history of the Christian people. When they are in bondage to Pharaoh, so are we. When they are admonished to act or to do a thing, we are admonished to do that thing. Think about the Passover. When Christ fulfills the Passover through his death and burial, through his own Passover, and then institutes the Eucharist, that's how we continue that admonition to keep this festival forever. We do. Similarly, we are, when we go through Lent, this Exodus idea, this wilderness, waiting for the promised land, awaiting the resurrection, awaiting Pascha. We are fed spiritually throughout Great Lent. Think about the liturgy of the Presanctified. We are fed. There's not a lot of food, but we are given spiritual food. God provides for us miraculously. We hear the words of the law. We hear the words of the institution of the law and the covenant. And then we see the work of Christ to help us fully understand and unpack all of those things. So Exodus as itself sets the stage for a lot of stuff that we believe and hold true and hold dear in Orthodoxy, because it's so central to the life of the Christian. It's not just a key event for Israel, it is a key event for the new Israel, who's us. So we have our own Passover, we have our own bondage, we have our own circumcision. All of these things are true of the Christian. So just a couple of interesting tidbits. Just a couple of interesting things about the book. The word Exodus actually is the name that comes out of the Greek. In Hebrew, it says now it's called El Shemot. These are the names, or now these are the names, because that's the first words. Hebrew books the majority of the Hebrew books are named by the first words or first statement of the book. So Genesis is Bereshit, in the beginning. Exodus is El Shemot. These are the names. But the Septuagint, the Greek, calls it Exodus, meaning the departure or the going out. And then, which of course we see this, the Exodus actually starts in chapter 1. It culminates in chapter 12 through 15, the departing out of Israel. And then for the rest of the book, we see this opening up of what it means to worship God. God reveals himself for the first time truly in this book. He gives them a name to call him. He's not just El Shaddai, the God Most High, or the God who provides. El Elyon, the God who is above all the gods. He's not just the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, the God of my fathers, kind of in this general sense of this is our local family deity. He has a name, and he has a name that means the existing one, the one who is. And maybe in comparison, maybe slightly tongue-in-cheek, the God who actually is. The God who is by himself. He is self-existing and full of his own, and self-alive, which is something hard to understand because especially in the ancient world, the gods come out of a mythology. The gods come out of you see something powerful and great, there must be a god associated with it. The sun and the moon, the sky, the water, the land, the desert, all these things must have a god, a spirit associated with them. This God just is. And in and of himself, he is. I said I won't dicker too much about authorship. I think that it's fairly clear from the book itself and from the witness of the New Testament that Moses is our author, that he received these words through divine inspiration. We see this, the way he talks about himself, the things that take place, and then the witness later on, Christ says, Moses wrote of me, several different times. Moses said, you have heard that Moses said, Moses wrote of me. St. Paul assumes Moses is the author of the book, and I see no reason to really really pick that apart too much. There are a handful of theories as far as when it takes place and who was the pharaoh and all these sorts of things. But I think it's more important to say that, like, let's say along with St. Augustine, that the Old and New, that this book really ties in, like I just said, the Old and New Testament. It's really a founding place for our understanding in the New Covenant. St. Augustine said that the New Testament is concealed in the Old, and that the Old is revealed in the New. We fully understand the Old Covenant by living in the New, and that the New Covenant is prefigured in the Old. These are the things that this is what the covenant will look like as we get there, because it's in the Old Covenant. If you think about, we read in the book of Hebrews, God revealed himself at various times through various means, through physical sacrifices, through modifications to your body, through all these sorts of things that took place. But in the last days, he's revealed himself through Christ. So God prepares us to hear Christ by giving us all these prefigurements to understand who Christ is, and what these things will look like for our own exodus, for our own departure, for our own coming into the promised land. And as I was reading through the book, kind of in preparation, just some things that really stuck out to me. One, there's a lot of water in the book of Exodus. The river is mentioned multiple times, the Red Sea, the waters at Mamre, the well where Moses meets his wife, the water from the rock. There's so much water imagery, this baptismal imagery, and also birth and rebirth is very important. Because if you remember from the first, and we'll get into it, the first chapters are about the birth of children and then the birth of Moses. When Israel is about to partake of the Passover, and we'll talk about this more in detail in a couple of weeks, they cover their door with blood. Well, the people who come out of that door are a reborn new people. They're no longer in bondage. They are free. Death has passed over them. They are the new birth. Truly, then of course, passing through the Red Sea and the water closes back over behind them. Again, a baptismal imagery. They're a new people. Even their oppressors have left them. They are just themselves and God. We have, of course, the 40 days in the wilderness that Christ spends in Matthew chapter 4, and then 40 years in the desert, but also 40 days that Moses is on top of the mountain receiving the law. And interestingly, the first Moses in 40 days receives the book of the law, and then Christ on his 40 days in the wilderness recites the book of the law. Mm-hmm. He's that new Moses, that new lawgiver, and you even see that in Matthew 5 and 6, the Sermon on the Mount. Christ is in the wilderness on top of a mountain teaching thousands of people. And he's teaching them from the law. You have heard that it was said, but I say. He's the new lawgiver. In fact, Matthew's gospel is very clear that Christ is this fulfilled Moses figure. You'd recognize Christ if you really knew who Moses was, because he's doing all these things that Moses did. And so the ties between the two testaments, especially in the book of Exodus, just keeps growing and growing and growing. Just these concentric circles go further and further and further out. The book of Exodus is a confirmation of God's promises. He's going to set a kingdom of priests and a holy nation whose people will enjoy heavenly food and spiritual drink, and will set a sanctuary for God to dwell in their midst. And that takes place in a divine relationship. God speaks to Moses like a friend. In fact, it's very clear multiple times no one spoke to God like Moses, like a man speaks to a friend. That Moses is the one person who can go into the tabernacle, into the holy place, and the Lord speaks to him. And he's so radiant that the people demand he cover his face because they just can't bear to look at it. But he's the one who sees where the glory of God has been. He's the one who understands. He's the one who has that relationship with God. And that relationship is then made most full through Christ, who in his incarnation takes on all that it is to be human. And now we don't have a relation with a transcendent being that we can't understand and who can't comprehend us. but has taken on all of what it means to be us. And that's what fulfills that promise of a heavenly kingdom, a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, spiritual food and drink, a tabernacle, a temple within where God can dwell, that we are the temple of the Holy Spirit. That all is prefigured in that relationship, God and Moses. So Christ in the Old Testament, it's hard to get too much further away than Moses, because it's just so overt. Moses is preparing us for Christ. He's the great deliverer. He speaks to God like a friend, like he has a personal one-on-one relationship with God. He is all of the things that prepare us. He is all of us in our need for that relationship, and that preparation for Christ, who fulfills that relationship. Obviously, Christ is greater than Moses, but even Moses even prepares us for Christ. One will come greater than I. A prophet will come who is greater than I am, and he is going to explain the book of the law in a way that I can only write it down. He's going to tell you what it really means. He's going to bring you on your full exodus. And so the church receives the life of Moses to learn from it vivid aspects of the spiritual life. Again, Origen interprets the books of Moses very symbolically, and it's tricky ground because, of course, Origen was condemned as a heretic and he's been deposed, but it's for a handful of things he said. His typology, his interpretation of the Old Testament sets the groundwork for St. Gregory the theologian and St. Basil the Great, who then later expound on the books of the Old Testament as they relate to Christ. They use his source material because the things that he read and the things that he developed, his theology as he understood it, was so strong and pointed us so firmly at Christ that they couldn't get away from it. There's no other theologian who did that. So without him, we don't have all this really good Orthodox theology in the Old Testament. Tricky places to be. So the church does not reject his Old Testament theology, but it does reject his soteriology and his self-mutilation.
Is he the one that I don't know that much about Origen, but did he teach about like that everybody is going to be saved?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and that's really that, and he castrated himself. The church said those are sins. Like A, this is a false doctrine. This all will be saved, and B, self-mutilation. Like these are sins. And that's really where they rest. Those 2 points were really what he was condemned for. And even then, we were so hesitant to actually. Origenism is a heresy. Really, Origen should be a heretic. When you read the council, when you read the works of the councils, there's this like hesitancy to condemn Origen himself, because he's so influential, and his work is so powerful and has inspired so much other great theology. And he's actually I think the only one of our like declared heretics that we've had that issue with. Origen was dead. He had been long dead. The question, can you declare someone a heretic who's dead? Can you anathematize someone who's dead? They had that debate. Like, can we even do that? Arius was there. All right, Arius, we've determined these are heresies. I refuse to repent. You made your choice. Origen was dead. So there's some tricky points that go along with that. But we do have to take that into account. Origen is a heretic. Origen's theologies have been anathematized, but we have used his Old Testament writings to understand, as we have written later about the Old Testament, you can't escape Origen. He's the first person outside of the apostles to find Christ in the Old Testament. I find that significant. Where was I on my notes? I'm sorry. I printed these instead of putting them on my tablet because my tablet is broken and I can't scroll anymore, so I'm trying to find where I am on my page. So Origen spoke significantly about the prophet Moses and all of his actions as signs of the living spiritual law that touches the inner life of the believer and a sign of his spiritual growth. So people like St. Clement of Alexandria was very fond of the personality of Moses, and And so were the early fathers of the Alexandrian school. He believed that the Greek philosophers, having come with some truth, actually received it from Moses, thus are counted as babes compared with the Hebrews, that they didn't have the full meat of Moses, but that they learned these things. These things were not in a vacuum. Hi, Evan.
Good morning.
Good morning. Moses was the first wise man, the first to present the grammar to the Jews, who passed on to the Phoenicians and from them to the Greeks. That somehow the Greeks received their thinking, their deep thinking and philosophy via Moses, kind of in a roundabout way through the Phoenicians. He also said that the philosopher Plato depended for law on the books of Moses, and the philosophers believed that the wise man is alone a king, a lawgiver, a leader, just, holy, and beloved by God. So if we realize that all these characteristics apply to Moses, this is St. Clement of Alexandria here, as it is clear from the holy books themselves, we can surely deduce that Moses is the true wise man. Clement also believed that the philosophy of Moses bears four aspects: historical, judicial, sacrificial, and visional. And as you read the books of Moses, you see all these things. He's not just interested in history. He's also, the books of Moses are called the law. Each of these 5 books is judicial. They're meant and instructional. They give us the views. They teach us about sacrifice and what true sacrifice really is. Everything from Cain and Abel, all the way through the books of Deuteronomy, we have this unrolling of the theology of sacrifice. What does a true sacrifice look like? And of course, visional. Moses receives his instructions for the tabernacle by receiving visions of heaven. Like, write down everything you saw in your vision and instruct the people to do the same thing. And you see, of course, that fulfilled in Christ. He is all those things: a king, a lawgiver, a leader, just, holy, beloved by God, historical, judicial, sacrificial, visional. We see this fulfilled in the person of Christ. And then afterwards, St. Gregory of Nyssa, also Alexandrian, recorded in a book in the life of Moses, where he said, sorry, I don't have a book on that. But the Alexandrians, of course, Origen being Alexandrian, the Alexandrian fathers rely heavily on his works to then write their theologies about Moses in the books of Exodus. We're just kind of talking about Exodus as a piece of literature and who Moses is. We haven't missed the whole... we haven't gotten into the passage yet. So I think some things to think about as we look at Exodus. It is, among many things, a book about salvation and redemption, a book about the Passover. It is a book of commandments and teachings on worship and how we are to worship, but also that the wilderness is the place where we are and where we most learn from God who he is. We'll see this later on in Hosea. God says to the people through the prophet Hosea, he says, I would call you back to the desert where I once wooed you and spoke lovingly to you. If, like, in the desert, you really needed me, and you've left me for all these other gods. You're the unfaithful wife, traveling all over here and there, marrying yourself off to other gods. But in the desert, you really needed me. So he says, I'm going to draw you back into the wilderness, and that's where I'm going to woo you once more. And that's what we see, of course, in the Babylonian captivity. God does not abandon them to the Babylonians. He doesn't leave them to their exile. He's present fully with them. We have Daniel. We have Jeremiah. Well, Jeremiah doesn't go to Babylon. We have Daniel, but Jeremiah wrote to the Jews in Babylon. We have Ezekiel, who were working and living and actively teaching the word of God in Babylon, revealing to them who God is and bringing them back to that relationship. God's going to send us back to the promised land. This is the God that we have worshipped. This God, he's greater than these gods. And he's greater than all the other gods you thought you were going to worship. You think about this, we read about it, I think it's at Nativity, the vision of the dry bones. Ezekiel is in the valley with all the dry bones. And God says, prophesy, and the wind moves. And the bones rattle and connect themselves, and then they have muscle and sinew and flesh and blood, and then they breathe. It's this recreation, it's this new exodus these dead will rise up and they will come to serve God. It's the same kind of thing. It's this wilderness, it's this barren place. There's nothing left to the Israelites. To the Jews in captivity, they have no temple, they have no sacrifices, they have, all their priests have been made eunuchs, all their wise men and all their nobility have been placed as slaves or eunuchs in the services of other kings. What's left to them? But God will restore them, bring them back from this barren wilderness into this full relationship. Again, Adam knocking on the doors of paradise, weeping for his home. So a couple of things that St. John Chrysostom talks about when he looks at the wilderness specifically. The Lord gave, quoting Exodus chapter 12, the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so they granted them what they requested of silver, gold, and garments. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. That was somewhat like a St. John sees this as like a down payment on the riches of eternal life. But at the same time, the Lord was like a father who gave his children some money in the morning in order to encourage them to go to school and listen to their teachers. St. John, of course, is the ancient world. You used to have to pay your teacher every day. St. Augustine writes about that. He hates it. Because all the rich kids don't want to study, and all the poor kids can't afford them. Again, St. John, at the time that they spent in the school grew longer, they started to murmur, to long for returning to Egypt and forsake their studies. They were like crying children, saying, "Why have you dealt with us like this? Couldn't we just go back to Egypt?" You see, the wilderness of the school, God sends them out to learn, even prepares. They plunder the Egyptians. They leave with all these gold, silver, and garments. But the school is long. The school is hard. The children misbehave towards their father, and Moses towards God their father, and Moses their teacher. And so because of their foolishness, Moses breaks the books of the law, as though he wished to stop teaching them. And yet he's immediately moved with compassion. Moses comes down and smashes the books of the law as they're sacrificing before the golden calf. He smashes the books of the law. Done. Whatever. And then God says, just stay back and I'll wipe them out. And Moses says, I can't. I love them. You love them. I can't do that. Because of their weakness, he gave them his law, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, to keep them from over-avenging themselves. And once they reach the stage of maturity, they're able to say, do not repay evil for evil. Whoever slaps you on one cheek, turn them the other. They've reached the point where they can hear the deeper, like they can understand the deeper meanings of the commandment. When they faced Pharaoh, when they faced Amalek, the Lord was with them on their side. St. John pictures these peoples as children saying to their father, so-and-so beat me on my way to school. And he answers, he's an evil person. Do not worry. I shall beat him back for you. God fights for them. God destroys the Egyptians. Stand back and see what the Lord will do to your enemies at the Red Sea. When they're fighting the Amalekites in the wilderness, Moses stands with his arms outstretched as a cross. And the people are driven back. The enemies of God are driven back. God fights for them. All these things reveal a way that the wilderness is our school. We were talking about this earlier today. Just that, like, we often talk about Great Lent as our school of salvation. It's our wilderness time. And it is long, and it is hard. We do have a very basic commandment. Don't eat meat, all these things. We have these very basic commandments, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, very kind of visceral, kind of human understanding commandments. But we're also given, if you understood what this meant, I desire mercy instead of sacrifice, then you would keep all the other parts of the law. You read the chapter from Isaiah. True fasting is this. I hate your fasts. I hate your festival days. They stink because you're doing them formulaically. There's no love, there's no mercy, there's no tenderness and compassion. You're not setting the captives free. You're not taking care of widows and orphans. These are filthy things because there's no heart in them. And so that's where we find ourselves. We have the basic commandments, our wilderness school in Great Lent, but there's a deeper, richer, fuller commandment that we're called to follow, that we are called to embody as we make our way through our wilderness experience and towards the promised land, towards the resurrection, towards Pascha.
And it seems as though that's like where we look at it even at the longer view in life, that maybe being in the womb would be like being in the garden. And being born into this world before death is all our wilderness experience. I mean, maybe that was, being in Egypt and being fed and safe or whatever it was, and then all of a sudden it was time, we were enslaved to the womb and we needed to get out and and then all this life is this teaching, and then
absolutely.
May death be the promised land.
And then, of course, we know that death is the promised land, and that the death has opened paradise.
Right.
We're no longer Adam pounding on the gates saying, "Let me back in." There's no fiery sword keeping us from the tree of life. We have full access to the tree of life. Christ has opened paradise for us. There's this ancient poem. It's not, I wouldn't really call it a hymn because it's non-liturgical. It's kind of this dramatic poem about the thief on the cross trying to get into paradise. But the resurrection hasn't happened yet. But Christ has said today. So the angels are like, we can't let you in. He's like, but Christ said I could come in. So this back and forth between the thief and the angels at the gates of paradise, and eventually he's brought into paradise, kind of as a foretaste of the coming of the resurrection. You have this like one person, but he's at the head of an army. He's the guy running from marathon. And it's a fantastic. There's documentation that it was actually performed kind of in church. You would have a young altar boy reading the role of the thief, and then a deacon would read the role of the angel, and they talk back and forth between the iconostasts, and then eventually an older altar server would come and carry the young boy into the altar on his back.
Oh wow!
It's just fun little. It's non-liturgical. It's not dogmatic, but it's this beautiful picture of that overthrow of death. And I think you see that in people like Abel. Abel is killed. He's murdered brutally by his brother, but his blood cries out. And it's this foretaste of what's coming. Death is not the end of the story, even in Genesis. Even with the first death, death is not the end of the story. God is still intimately concerned with the plight of humanity, with the plight of his people. So you have that coming into Egypt, which initially is very positive for the people of Jacob, the Israelites. And so Moses begins picking right up where Genesis leaves off with, these are the names of the household that came with Jacob. And he lists the 12 tribes. And it says, now Joseph died, as well as all his brothers. Then the children of Israel increased and multiplied, became numerous, and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. They're everywhere. And that's, of course, the promise right there. As much as numerous as the sand on the sea, as the sand on the shore, so shall your descendants be. The land is filled with the people of God, which you would think would be a good thing. But, I love the word but in the Bible, because it just signals something major is going to happen. But there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And this is, when you look at Egyptian history, and I've actually heard this from an Egyptian, so I'm taking it from him. Egyptians see their history kind of in three ups and two downs, like a W. There's like three times of prosperity for the Egyptians, and 3 times of turmoil, and 2 times of turmoil, where they were invaded by somebody else and taken over. Their land was taken from them, and then they cast all those people out, and they reestablished their kingdoms of great wealth and grandeur. This was during one of those times when the Hyksos had taken over the Egyptians. They were Canaanite, so they were from the north, same location as Joseph and his brothers. And they had been in charge. They had been oppressing the Egyptians, as they saw it, for so long. When they finally expelled the Hyksos, well, the next thing they did was look for the people who were like them. what other Canaanites do we have living here? Well, there's several 100,000 of them living over there. You can kind of put yourself in Pharaoh's mind for a little bit. We just expelled one enemy. These guys are cousins. Let's deal with them too. And he even says this race of children of Israel is so great, they're stronger than we are. Let us outwit them. As if. Therefore he set taskmasters over them to afflict them in their work. And they built strong cities for Pharaoh. But the more the Egyptians humbled the Israelites, the more they multiplied and grew, and the Egyptians greatly abhorred the children of Israel. So they began to tyrannize them. And they forced the children of Israel to work. They made their lives bitter with hard labor, in mortar, in brick, and in all manner of service in the field, and all their labor in which they made their service was by violence. So it wasn't just a working relationship, let's build these great cities, it'll be good. He then set taskmasters over them. People would tell them what to do, when to be there, how to be there. And then he set them, then it became by violence, by tyranny, forced labor, do all the work, or die. And then, as if to make matters worse, he tells the Hebrew midwives, whose names are Shiphrah and Puah. I love that their names are given to us. When you do the duties of a midwife, kill all the male children. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children. When the king of Egypt calls them and says, "What are you doing? All these male babies, I told you to kill them." And they have this great moment where they just say, "Oh, well, Hebrew women give birth faster than Egyptian women. So by the time we get there, the baby's already born." What can I say? They're just too fast for us. Therefore, God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew greatly. And so far, we have named the children of Israel. We do not have a named Pharaoh. We just have a king of Egypt. We don't have named taskmasters. The first names we have outside of the faithful sons of Israel are these two midwives. Just these two women who feared God and wouldn't obey the evil commands of a king. And so they're memorialized for us. Shiphrah and Puah, these faithful Hebrew midwives. In fact, I think they're mentioned in a couple of prayers. I'd have to look for it, but I'm almost positive that we mentioned these two women in a couple of our prayers in the church.
On the canon of St. Andrew.
I'm sure they're in the canon of St. Andrew. Everybody's in the canon of St. Andrew.
Now, this year, maybe I'll know who they are.
There you go. So Shiphrah and Puah outmaneuvered Pharaoh because they feared God. And God blesses them. God deals well with them. Maybe he gave them lots of children. We don't know. Just that he dealt well with them. But Pharaoh didn't go execute them. Right? They disobeyed his commandment. Pharaoh believes we'll say lie, but their distraction, their diversion. Hi. And God deals well with them. And so Pharaoh takes matters into his own hands. He tells soldiers. He commands all his people, saying, "Every male born of the Hebrews you shall cast into the river." That's the law of the land. Cast all the male children into the river. And this is our first water image in Exodus. And I'll stop. I won't talk about all the water. Let's talk about these two water moments. The Egyptians are told to throw all the male children into the river. Just throw them into the river. Which is in some way kind of a horrific sacrifice to the life of Egypt. Because the river is everything. And ancient Egypt really extends 6 miles on either side of the Nile. Everything else is out of Egypt. Because that's where the fertility of the Nile is, left to right, east to west on either side, about 6 miles. That's Egypt, as far as they're concerned. So the Nile is really the heart, the lifeblood of the nation. And they sacrifice the children to it. They have grown and increased in number beyond us. We will take their firstborn, we will take all their male children and sacrifice it to the river, to our God, and she will bless us and cause us to be more fertile. And then a child is born in the house of Levi, not Judah, not Reuben, not Simeon, not Joseph, like the house of Levi. And he is called a good child, a beautiful child. It's the same language God uses in in Genesis. He's very good, tov meod. He's very good. That same kind of language used at the creation. And they hid him for 3 months. That must have been very challenging. And when they could no longer hide him, she took an ark, made of bulrushes, daubed it with asphalt, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the riverbank, and set his sister to watch it. So we have an ark. Again, the Nile River floods. We have an ark protecting from the flood. We've got this basket made out of grass covered in pitch, just like the ark. And it's the ark of salvation. And little does the infant know what this means. But I think his mother knew. This is the one. There's something about this child that sets him apart from all the other children. I'm going to save him. I think she knows. The power or the intuition of mothers, maybe. And then he's found by Pharaoh's daughter. He's found by Pharaoh's daughter while she's bathing in the river. It's kind of this baptismal kind of imagery here. The river has been this place of death, but it becomes the place of life. We go down into the water and back out again. We die with Christ and are resurrected in new life. The river has been the place of death, and God, in his infinite sense of irony, makes it the place of salvation and life. And I just think that's fantastic. This is the first of our water images in the book of Exodus. The river is central. Water becomes very, very important, and it's always in this baptismal idea. The place of death, the place of new life, because Pharaoh's daughter adopts him as her own son, and then he's brought back to his mother. She's not nursing. She needs someone to nurse the baby. He's only 3 months old. And his sister, in her infinite wisdom, says, I know, well, I might be able to find a Hebrew woman who could nurse him. Oh, that'd be great. Take him. And again, you don't see it overtly here, but the maiden went, called the child's mother, and Pharaoh's daughter said, take this child and nurse him. I think she knew. She's willing to defy the rule of Pharaoh not to drown the baby when she finds him. A little thing like finding his mother is not going to be problematic. This little girl wasn't just happening to be by the river, who just happened to know a woman who was breastfeeding. Like Pharaoh's daughter knew. She knew what she was up to. And then when the child is weaned, around 5 years old, he's brought back to the palace and raised as Pharaoh's daughter's son. And I think, again, take that baptismal imagery. We are brought out of the waters. Moses, brought out of the waters. We are fed with the milk, spiritual milk, as we're infants and babes, catechized, growing. And then there's a level of like maturing and growing where we start to understand ourselves in our life in the church. That's bigger and deeper than just a basic understanding. We grow in maturity. Moses is brought into a new life in the temple. But he's had 5 years with his mother. He's had 5 years learning from her about the God that she worships, about the people of Israel, about the oppression of Israel. He knows who he is. I think those stories where Moses accidentally finds out he's a Hebrew, they make great drama, but they're bad scripture. He's raised in his mother's house, literally at her knee. And she saved him for something special. You were special, I saved you. So when we get to the next chapters 2 through 6, Moses tries to be deliverer and savior on his own power before he's empowered by God to go and save the people. But he knows what he's doing when he goes out to judge the Israelites and kill Egyptians. He knows what he's doing. So this is where we will end. So Exodus, if Genesis opens up an introduction to who God is and our life in this world, Exodus paints in stark, beautiful spiritual realities that we are in the wilderness, going to the promised land, being schooled and fed and taught by God, and being prepared to enter, to cross Jordan, to enter into the fullness of that kingdom and what that will look like, which is ultimately fulfilled in the coming of Christ. awaiting consummation even now. So we'll go drink our spiritual milk and eat our spiritual food across the way. So we'll do the rest of chapter 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe the burning bush next week, but at least those first few those intervening chapters next week.